Good afternoon, good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's conversation about an inspiring and really optimistic vision for how we can scale our conservation responses to meet the scale of the environmental crises we confront in today's world. My name is John Peterson, and I serve on the staff for the Network for Landscape Conservation. I want to quickly move us into what really promises to be a rich and thought-provoking conversation. But before I do so, I wanted to take a moment to introduce the Network for Landscape Conservation. The network emerged a decade ago now from the observation that more and more people were coming together to think at scale about our landscapes. And the network is that space where landscape conservation practitioners can come together. The network is a community, really, as much as it is an organization. All of us on this call today and others like us across the continent, we all are the network. We are a community that is connected by shared work, the work of collaborative landscape conservation. And the network really serves to connect us all, to support us all, and to help us all learn from one another, to explore together, to advance our work. I would encourage folks to spend a few moments exploring the shared activities of this community by visiting our website, and be sure to sign up for our bulletin if you haven't done so already to stay connected and engaged in the community. Today's conversation will touch down on landscapes across the continent, from the boreal forests of Canada to the oyster beds of Delmarva and beyond. And as we think about the present and future of these landscapes, let us not overlook or ignore the past. At the network, we strive to carry our work forward in a way that recognizes tribal sovereignty and First Nation sovereignty, recognizes the devastating and ongoing impacts of colonialization and genocide, and recognizes the continuing knowledge, expertise, and work of Indigenous peoples. So though we are in virtual space and not together in place, in this spirit, I share that I myself am joining from what is presently the Massachusetts-Vermont state border, but is the ancestral lands of the Skokie Band of the Western Abenaki. And as I acknowledge and honor the long-standing connection to place and the deep stewardship, past, present, and future, of the original inhabitants of my home landscape, let us all take a moment to honor and acknowledge those whose land we stand on currently. And I would encourage folks to use the chat if they feel comfortable doing so, to share your own acknowledgement from your own home landscape. And so now it is really my distinct pleasure to introduce the panelists for today's conversation, and I'll do so alphabetically. Brenda Barrett is the editor of the Living Landscape Observer and brings a focus on landscape scale conservation, heritage preservation, and sustainable community development to her work. Among many other tasks and activities that she dedicates her time to, Brenda is a member of the coordinating committee for the Network for Landscape Conservation. Valerie Courtois is the founding director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, a national network of Indigenous leaders who work to support and promote Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship in Canada. She is a registered professional forester by trade and has worked as a planner and strategic advisor for a number of First Nation throughout her career. She is a member of the Innu community of Massachusetts, Quebec, and now lives in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador, with her partner, Patrina, and is the proud mom of Andrea. And finally, let me introduce Tony Hiss. Tony is the author of 15 books, including the award-winning The Experience of Place. He was a staff writer at The New Yorker for more than 30 years, a visiting scholar at New York University for 25 years, and has lectured around the world. He lives with his wife, the writer Lois Metzger, in New York City, and his latest book, Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth, has just been published and is the impetus for today's conversation. We are thrilled and really honored to welcome you all for today's conversation. I can't wait to dig in with you. Tony, I'll turn to you first in a moment just to run through a brief set of slides to orient us to the Half Earth vision and what you found in researching and writing your book. And from there, we'll move directly into conversation. As the conversation unfolds, I would encourage attendees to use the chat to share reactions, additional thoughts, or any questions you have. And though we surely will not have time to pick up all the questions that come in, our hope is that today's conversation is a spark for continuing reflection and conversation within the broader landscape conservation community. A final note, we have partnered with an independent bookstore to make signed copies of Rescuing the Planet available for purchase. I will put a link in the chat momentarily for anyone interested in doing so. And with that, Tony, I'm going to turn it to you and let you take us away.
Thanks, John. It's such a privilege to be here today with the wonderful hosting by the network and to sit down even virtually with Val Courtois and Brenda Barrett, two people whose work I so greatly admire. And having them here means at least 2/3 of the continent is represented today, since Val is joining us from Goose Bay and Brenda's today in South Carolina. My book is about protecting half of all land and water to stave off a mass extinctions crisis, and about my travels across North America, encountering many extraordinary people and projects and a great upbeat spirit and strategies. So many that I'd say we're well on our way. John, could I have the next slide, please? There's certainly a tremendous amount to do. Beyond climate change and intertwined with it, the world faces a grave calamity. 1 million species are at imminent risk of extinction, and some are already gone. This is Sudan, the last male northern white rhino, who died in Kenya in 2018. Next, please. We've already come up with a word we shouldn't have to need, endling. And endling is the last of its kind. This is Lonesome George, the last known Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who died in 2012 at the age of 101. Next, please. All this is a contradiction in some ways, because despite 5 mass extinctions in the planet's history, marked by the yellow triangles on this slide, the general trend has been up, 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 even after the cataclysm that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Some think we're now on the way to a 6th major extinction. And that poses the question, what's it going to be, save or 6? Next, John, please. It's a good thing people are starting thinking at a different scale, as they have been, because 35 years ago, it was already beginning to be obvious that conventional thinking about conservation just wasn't working out right. We couldn't just designate some special places and figure maybe we'd done enough. Because if these special places get walled off by building around them, they can no longer serve the function of providing for the animals they were supposed to protect. Next, please. For a long time, at least in this country on the continent, we were beholden to a vision like this called American Progress, seen here in a painting in 1872. Progress, that golden-haired young lady with not very many clothes on, is heading west, trailing telegraph wires behind her as she's accompanied by a covered wagon, a stagecoach, and railroads. And farmers follow her. People and animals are displaced. In the lower left-hand corner, a bear is snarling. And behind Progress, the golden-haired young lady, the sky is lightning. Next, please. A word about this fierce-looking Russian scientist, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. In the 1920s, he wrote the first definitive account of the biosphere. He's revered in Russia, less known here. In Russia, they've named a Moscow subway station after him and a crater on the dark side of the moon. And what Vernadsky pointed out was that the biosphere is incredibly old. We now know it to be at least 3.8 billion years old, and it's incredibly broad, this layer of life that contains everything living. But it has a third dimension, a far more precarious dimension. Its height, or lack thereof. Almost all of life can be contained in a thin band that stretches from the bottom of the ocean to the top of Everest. That's only 12.5 miles. Stretched out horizontally, it would mean you could drive it in 20 minutes. You could drive from one end of life to the other. So here we have something that's amazingly robust and ancient, and also by its very nature precarious. Next, please. Another person who started thinking beyond loss to seeing larger areas that could be handled and cherished and protected was a forester named Benton Mackay, who in 1900 graduated from college, celebrated by bushwhacking up Stratton Mountain in Vermont, climbing to the tallest tree, swaying there. Suddenly he was overcome with a thought that he later called a planetary feeling. He thought he could see the entire range of the Appalachians from Maine all the way to Georgia as a single place. Next, please. From that came his vision of the Appalachian Trail, which was then constructed 2,190 miles long from Maine to Georgia, constructed almost entirely by volunteers and still maintained today by volunteers. But for Mackay, that was only half of the vision. The trail, which ran along the ridgetops, was the anchor for a much larger region, which he called the realm, the Appalachian realm. A realm which is now being rediscovered by the current conservators of the trail as they move into protection over the next 100 years of the whole Appalachian realm. And as we can see, the Appalachians have been a migratory corridor for at least 100,000 years. Next, please. If you look at this map, which shows the 4 large landscapes that define North America, the Appalachian realm on the right is really the smallest of the 4. It's parallel on the west by the Rockies, and the parallel to Benton Mackay in the west was a Canadian activist and lawyer named Harvey Locke, who one night had a vision in his own mind and saw the entire landscape from Yellowstone National Park, the first national park anywhere, all the way up to the Yukon as a single place. And from that came the Yellowstone to Yukon, or Y2Y initiative, which has protected at least 21% of that landscape in the last 25 years. And it's embedded in an even larger landscape, the Western Wildway stretching from Mexico all the way up to Alaska. And then the most amazing landscape of all, across the top of the continent, the Boreal forest, 3,700 miles long, 1,000 miles thick, the most intact wildness in the country, in the continent, in the world, less cut over than Siberia or the Amazon, and still, fortunately, the home to so many First Nations who are now taking an active part in its management. Then along the South Coast, more recently discovered the North American Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. We're very lucky to have such great geography on this continent, because the geology is telling us how important every place is and how to see it in our mind's eye. Next, please. This all leads us to the idea of how much is enough. It's the question I get asked more often than any other. Why 50%? Well, there's several reasons. One is empirical studies have showed over and over again that so many animals need at least 50% of their original habitat to thrive or survive. Currently, we've protected 15% of the continent. And that took 150 years after Yellowstone to get to that place. But that's only going to guarantee the future of about 25% of the species. We also can do some predictive math, thanks to E.O. Wilson and many of his followers and colleagues. If we can bump that up to 50%, there's a good chance of saving 85 to 90% of the animals and plants. Not everything, but almost everything. Next, please. Now, of course, that puts a tremendous agenda in front of us to get from 15% to 50% in the next 30 years means we're going to have to start protecting land at a rate at least 12 times higher than we ever have before. So we're discovering more and more about the wonders of the biosphere almost daily. On the left, this spider recently discovered in India was named by its discoverers Aerovixia gryffindori on purpose because it reminded them of the sorting hat from Harry Potter. And they wanted everyone to see the wonders of nature as reflected in the human imagination. On the right, this African vulture can fly so high, one of them once collided with a jet plane. Next, please. So within this context of something enormous and ancient, but at the same time vulnerable, we can go back to the half-earth blackboard and talk about 3 R's. Retain what is wild, still wild, restore what was once wilder, and reconnect those areas that have been severed. Next, please, John. Back to the Boreal. The most stunning landscape we have. And now the Canadians have realized that the best hope for keeping it as it is to turn to the people who've lived there for 10,000 years, the First Nations of Canada, the people who are intimately acquainted over hundreds and hundreds of generations with the needs of all its plants and animals. And as a result, they're setting up extraordinary new kind of national parks. The Indigenous Protected Areas, or IPAs, suddenly leaping forward. And of course, we'll hear more from Val about that shortly. Next, please. This time, when we talk about 3 R's, we have to add a P. We're not going to forget people this time around. We're not going to displace them. Golden-haired progress is not going to displace anything or anyone. Next, please. But even in the Boreal, retain also means restore. A transcontinental highway traverses Banff National Park. In the summertime, there's 1 car every 3 minutes. Devastating effect on wildlife, a death trap for wildlife, until 25 years ago, they began a highway rewilding program, building 43 bridges and tunnels over and under the highway. And the result of that is that 200,000 grizzly bears, mountain lions, wolves, elk have safely crossed the highway. A wonderful development. 1 to 2 million large animals get killed on US highways every year. Up in Banff, they're saying roadkill is a word we can now think of as an obsolete term. Next, please. Another strategy is coming back into play, the so-called Green Line Park, the idea that you don't have to own everything in order to proclaim it to be special and a place that can be cherished. This was an initiative that started in the United States in the Adirondack Park up in the north of New York State, and then was captured by the English after World War II, when they set up a whole system of national parks and what they called areas of outstanding natural beauty. 30% of the country. It was going to be the great new initiative in the 1970s and 80s, an adjunct to our national park system. It was going to be the great rollout, the great legacy of the second Jimmy Carter administration. Only there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration because he was defeated for re-election by Ronald Reagan in 1980. I found an old map, rough and ready wall map of those such places. And to me, it's a treasure map, and now it's been redigitized, and here it is, and it's already well underway. Next, John, please. On the eastern shore of Maryland, where they're, instead of calling it an outstanding area, they're calling it an oasis. That whole peninsula has already pledged itself to protect 50% of its land, natural land and farmland by 2030. Up in New England, They've gone one better. They're talking about protecting 70% of the whole 6-state region as forests permanently by 2070 or 2060. Next, please. There's something that reaches out to people and brings them back into lifelong contact with the natural world. For birders, it's what they call a spark bird. That bird that first drew them in, reeled them in, and thereafter their life was never the same. They felt connected to the natural world. It doesn't have to be a bird. It could be a favorite view. It could be a favorite animal, or it could even be a wildflower, or as in the case of Benton Mackay, the kind of vision you get swinging from a treetop. Next, please. Finally, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. And as John said, the Country Bookshelf in Bozeman is standing by to take any orders, and we can't do actual book signings for the duration, but we can offer a social distancing special. Be happy to inscribe book plates that the bookstore can send on to you, even individually inscribed if you so wish. Thanks again.
Tony, that was really, really wonderful. You did a great job of summarizing your vision. But I still was left with a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. And one was, I was so struck by how focused you were on people. You said it in your whole book is structured around leadership of current practitioners, of visionary leaders from the past, visionary leaders of today. And I wondered how you came to that perspective, because quite a few books on saving half Earth or saving biodiversity don't take that human dimension into account, or they don't seem to be focused on people the way your book is.
Oh, thanks, Brenda. I guess I first started thinking about this, worrying about it 10 years ago or so, the plight of the animals. And I was fortunate early on to meet Edward O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist and the champion of biodiversity. And he encouraged me to keep going and was kind enough to introduce me to some of the people he was working with. For instance, a wonderful man down in the Panhandle of Florida named MC Davis, a self-made multimillionaire who had started out playing poker to raise a stake so he could get going in business, and who bought up 51,000 acres of ruined peanut farms so that he could resurrect the signature ecosystem of the Southeast, the longleaf pine forest. When I met him, he'd been planting 500,000 seedlings a year for 12 years. And the place still looked a little bedraggled to my eyes. And he said, well, we're in year 13 of a 300-year project. MC unfortunately is gone now, but he has endowed that project, so it will continue for the next 300 years or more. So through Ed, I met several people, and then that sort of got me started in my travels, and I realized there were these extraordinary people all over the continent doing such wonderful work. And that one of the trips I was able to take was up to the Boreal, where I began to meet some of Val's colleagues and hear about the exciting work being done with the IPAs. And the very first one was just about to be proclaimed at that point, at the Adeji IPA. But I know I'm way out of date. There's far more to talk about already. So it was meeting all these people and just the upbeat spirit that made me think, this is a problem we can actually do something about. We have a hope. It's within our grasp.
Well, thank you, Tony, so much. And I do think your book sort of radiates some optimism, and this is actually a doable thing. And I think it was really wonderful to start on your trip up the Mackenzie River. And Val, maybe you can talk a little more about the incredible work that's happening in the Boreal forest area in Canada.
Thanks, Brenda, and thanks, Tony. Yeah, there is genuine leadership by Indigenous peoples right across Canada, and it's not just a movement to protect lands. It's a social justice movement in many ways. It's really about creating a context where we can reconnect with our own territories, our own landscapes, and our identities following, you know, a very tough colonial period that we've lived through and survived. Why does this matter? Well, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is on lands controlled by or managed by Indigenous peoples. That's also true in Canada. And in fact, what we found at the International Boreal Conservation Campaign, which is a coalition that the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is a member of, that is in the last 20 years, our partners that we've helped support land use planning efforts with, in general, when Indigenous peoples hold the pen, they will protect over 60% of their landscapes. And so in many ways, the 30 by 30 and kind of the national targets are catching up with the view of Indigenous peoples in terms of what is the balance that needs to be in place for our relationship to survive, but also everything we depend on as a species to survive as well. And so that's the impetus for the work. And luckily, that leadership is becoming more and more recognized. Some of you may be aware that in the statement that emerged from the latest meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau, there was a explicit recognition of the role of Indigenous-led conservation to achieve those nature and climate targets. So that's the context that we're in Canada, and we're very excited that this movement is growing right across Turtle Island, what we call North America.
Wonderful. And I think, Valerie, you have a video to introduce ourselves and all the people watching this program to the region beyond the wonderful description in Tony's book.
Yes, thank you. It's a video that will tell you a little bit more about Indigenous protected areas, and in fact, it features a Deji, which is the area that Tony just mentioned. So enjoy.
The protected and conserved areas work. It's really about loving places that are amazing.
Indigenous people in Canada have been leading conservation efforts for decades. This includes the establishment of Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, to protect lands and waters we all depend upon. IPCAs are places that Indigenous nations identify for conservation, often through community-driven processes. Indigenous communities determine the goal for IPCAs and manage lands.
I have a vested interest. I have two little grandsons that are 4 and 2 years old. I want them to be able to enjoy the benefits of what the natural wilderness is able to provide you.
Sometimes you don't understand that until you're on the land and you're traveling on the water. You're participating in a setting where you're connecting. For our communities, it's a vital part of who we are.
IPCAs are often designated through Indigenous law and then through partnership agreements with Crown governments. IPCAs have already been established in places like Tusu Denilin Tuyaka, Edeji, and Tada Denene.
An establishment agreement is one of the most progressive, modern type of agreement where we will co-create, govern, manage, and operate Saidinene together equally.
Dozens more IPCAs have been proposed. Taken together, IPCA proposals could conserve over 500,000 square kilometers of the boreal forest region. Indigenous-led conservation offers the best way to reach Canada's goal of protecting 25% of lands by 2025, part of the global effort to address huge losses of animals and plants.
I'd be really humbled and pleased to be a part of that as a Canadian, but also, you know, as an Indigenous person, to be able to have that opportunity to protect our land.
IPCAs honor the relationship between people and the land. They ensure lands and cultures will thrive into the future.
Maybe if other Canadians could look at our land and see what we see, maybe, just maybe, they would want to protect it too.
Learn more about IPCAs at ilinationhood.ca.
Lovely, lovely video. Thank you, Valerie.
I always find that videos can do in a short time what it would take us a very long time to converse through, but it gives you just a flavor of the importance of this work and what's involved in establishing these areas.
That's fantastic, Valerie. And I certainly think that we in the United States could take away a lot of lessons from that. And I hope that the next conversation between our president and your prime minister may get down into the more details of how that can happen. And speaking of that, I'm seeing a number of questions in the chat, and these are certainly questions that I have, and perhaps you have too, Valerie. How does this book then fit into Canada's 25 by 25 initiative and the United States 20 by 30 initiative to try to preserve significant percentages of land by the year 2025 or 2030?
I think books like this book and others, the more that we talk about this, the more it becomes in the realm of the possible. When we first started over 20 years ago talking about the need to protect half of the boreal, and if there was to be any development, that be the best top world-class sustainable development models that are applied here, was a bit crazy. And some of the reactions that our campaign received was like, this is just nonsense. It's too much. We're at 4% or we're at 5% in terms of the jurisdictions of conservation. But the more that there were people talking about it, the more it became mainstream, the more buzz we were able to create, and the more that really individuals started to become aware that the paradigm that was in front of them that said, utilize as much as you can of natural resources, it's there for the benefit of human beings, is not a sustainable paradigm. And we're starting to realize that. I mean, we're feeling storms like we never felt. Climate change is in our face. I have had to change the timing that I go in the country because of climate change. And in fact, it delays my trip by over a month to be able to go interact with caribou, which is an important species for my culture. So it matters that all of this is out there, that more people are adhering to this vision. And it's not a vision where we're saying, the past is wrong. What we're saying is the future is opportune. And here's, based on what we know now, let's make the right decisions to make sure that the future generations have the same opportunities that we've had in terms of our relationship with these landscapes.
Brenda, the Boreal often has two nicknames. It's called North America's Bird Nursery because billions of birds fly up there every year to raise the new generation, songbirds and shorebirds. It's also known as the Fort Knox of carbon because the trees and the soil and the peat are holding on to so much carbon that if these trees were leveled, something like 37 years worth of fossil fuel emissions would be dumped into the air all at once. As far as Val was talking about things becoming more real, it's astonishing. When I first started working on this book maybe 10 years ago, even Ed Wilson said, well, let's throw out the number 50 by 50 and think of it as a BHAG, what they call in the business world a big, hairy, audacious goal, meaning something that seems outlandish, but at least is within the realm of the possible, at least more than 10% possible. And now suddenly, this whole subject is catching up with us. We have the US proclaiming a national goal this year of 50 by 50. 30 by 30, which I think of as a first step towards 50 by 50. We have 56 nations already proclaiming that goal of 30 by 30. We have an international meeting coming up in China at towards the end of the year, in which something like 196 nations will embrace the goal of 30 by 30 as a first step towards 50 by 50. I was thrilled to get a review this morning in the Wall Street Journal saying this looked sensible to them. Talk about a broad coalition of people coming together. I think this is an issue that is whose very urgency is speaking to people on so many different levels. and helping so many different groups come together.
Wonderful. And one of the questions that one of the our listeners posted in the chat, and I think is partly answered by your work, Valerie, was the question of how do you build access and equity into this kind of work, into parks and green spaces, and also the question of a sustainable agriculture in a 30 by 30 or a 50 by 50 world. And I think your book has some good examples of that. And clearly the work that's going on in Canada is just breaking new ground. But do you have any thoughts on that, Valerie or Tony?
Go ahead, Val.
I was going to say, go ahead as the author.
It's a tough question.
Look, there's a couple things that make IPCAs or Indigenous protected areas Indigenous. One is that there is a real ground up approach in terms of determining, what are the values that are going to be protected, or what are the reasons behind the effort. And in many ways, that impetus is often ensuring our food security, for example, or those sorts of factors, which are not traditional values that were promoted by what we call crown governments or public governments in their efforts. It's also important, not only who establishes it, but who is going to manage it in the long term. Yeah. And so we insist that is Indigenous led, to be recognized as an Indigenous protected area. And in many ways, after our colonial history here in Canada, it's a way of regaining authority over landscapes in the interim to the very complicated land claims process that exists here. And in many ways, the land claim process is still a legacy of that colonial approach. And so the experience of going through the recognition of your rights is one that you're doing despite the kind of the systemic colonial nature of those efforts. This is something else. This is really, it's pure in its nature and its approach, because it's simply about people deciding and recognizing that they have an impact on landscapes and therefore need to be responsible for that. And because we depend on those landscapes, we need to have reciprocity in that relationship. And I'm here today because the land has done its job. And I have a responsibility in that reciprocity of the relationship to make sure that that land therefore survives so that it can do its job for others.
Well, thank you to the land for making it possible for Val to be here today. We saw a map earlier of the Appalachian realm. This is an opportunity to make a kind of central park for all of East Coast North America, but that means it has to reach out to the people in the cities to the east of the Appalachian realm and the Midwestern cities to the west of it, and offer opportunities for those diverse cities, people in those diverse cities, to get up into the hills and experience the refreshment that's there. At the same time, the city people on either side of the Appalachian realm have for a long time not thought particularly about the hill folk in between and their needs, and they're in a special trouble because of so many years of neglect. So it's calling out to us in ways that we are not used to thinking about. And yet there it is as the reality that's around us. The needs of the people and the needs of the critters.
So I was also really excited to see that the treasure map, Tony, in your presentation and the discussion of Greenline parks. And of course, I've had many years working with national heritage areas and reserves and other large landscape works that both the federal government and many state governments are now undertaking. So do you think we have a framework of some ideas out there on the ground already we can sort of reactivate and re-energize?
Yes, I think it's been creeping up on us like everything else. And the fact that Delmarva, of all places, this peninsula on the East Coast, which has largely escaped development because to its good fortune, it was always, as they said, 15 minutes too far away to be swamped by cities and suburbs. And so it retains the look and feel of the place as it was 200 or 300 years ago. But it's been split down the middle, first by the Mason-Dixon line, which carved out Delaware from part of this peninsula, gave part of it to Maryland, part of it to Virginia, hence that odd name Delmarva, which they can't get away from. But the fact that they are coming together to think about a 30 by 30 goal is extraordinary in itself. I also want to say in terms of equity and reaching out, it turns out that city parkland, most of city parkland is actually still in very much of a natural state. Some of it bedraggled, some of it much better than that. But the 50 largest cities have sort of banded together, the parks in 50 largest cities, and they've realized that put together the natural areas in their parks constitute an area almost as big as Yellowstone National Park. So here's an enormous resource right at hand to get all kinds of people connected to.
Yeah. Going back to the challenges on the ground right now, do you think the pandemic and the sort of political divisions are going to slow down this effort? Or do you think it's something that based on, for example, that Wall Street Journal review today, that this will sort of reach over boundaries and actually that the pandemic will bring people together around this idea?
I think it is bringing people together. I mean, all the city folk were astonished, of course, during the early days of quarantine to be hearing birdsong for the first time in dozens of years when the traffic was stilled. And I think as we get back outside, we're trying to retain, how do we go about retaining that connection? There's in terms of your question about Green Line parks, there's a wonderful environmental planner up in Maine named Ulla Amundsen. And when people come to him and say, how do we get started? What do we need to do first? He always says, well, look around you and who is the Henry David Thoreau of your area, wherever you are? Who is the Andrew Wyeth of your area? Who's captured the great spirit and the essence of that place? And of course, there are local land trusts and neighbors banding together with neighbors, but there's so much going on that I think the pandemic will serve us well in that horrible thing to say about it in that sense. And the fact that there's now so much support for trying to do something better. Build back better means also restore, reconnect, and rewild.
Well, I'm glad to hear you give a shout out for storytelling as a critical part of this. I mean, I think your book is part of that wonderful storytelling that inspires people. And Valerie, I'm sure First Nation people and Indigenous people overall, storytelling is really a sort of the foundation of developing a land ethic.
Absolutely. Stories are how we learn.
Yeah.
Stories are how we share, and stories are how we care. And so I'm an avid reader, but I have to say I ate up Tony's book very quickly and rapidly because it was written in that way, and I found some familiarity in the approach. So I really appreciated that.
Thanks so much, Val. In terms of storytelling, the First Nations have always woven stories about animals into the stories about people, but even science is now consulting the animals and making them storytellers.
Yeah.
The rapid strides we're making in tagging animals and listening in to where they are. The whole Yellowstone to Yukon effort was aided by Pluie the wolf, a tagged wolf in the early 1990s, when they thought maybe would travel 60 miles or so. Turned out she traveled over a distance 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park through 2 Canadian provinces and 3 US states. Animals are the new storytellers too.
Yeah. And the other thing I thought was a great sort of heuristic device was your use of the cal and the y to come up with sort of a new measurement of size. Can you tell us, was that your invention, Tony, or is that, and for those who haven't read the book, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you describe land size so people can visualize it.
It came to me in the Boreal because it's so much beyond the size of anything a little city guy like me had ever encountered before or experienced. And I realized that I was talking with Steve Kallick, who's been working to protect the Boreal for 20 years. A Yellowstone is sort of the basic coin of size, the first national park anywhere, and it's about 2 million acres. But the next step up, the dollar bill size, is California, which is about 100 million acres. So 1 Y, 50 Ys equals 1 cal. Rough and ready. I mean, we try to think about the unthinkable by bringing it back down to size. What we talk about, for instance, astronomical units is the distances between planets. You know, there's 93 million miles to the sun, but there's only 1 astronomical unit. So here was a new kind of rough and ready astronomical unit. And the amazing thing about once you delineate that, there are not only room for many, many, many Ys up in the Boreal, there are room for several Cals, several California's worth of protected land in the next few years. So it's a new kind of measuring stick.
Yeah, I thought that was really fantastic because it was another way of visualizing and telling the story, because not everyone necessarily is going to read your book, although I give it a big plug, but how can we all help tell this story? How can we try to build this into policy, reduce some of the lessons from your book? What would you suggest?
Well, everyone who's doing anything is part of the story. I mean, that's the great new insight I think we have. And that was another thing I realized running around the country and talking to people around the continent, dipping into Mexico as well, was that so many of these different approaches, a lot of the people aren't aware of what the other guy's doing yet.
Yeah.
And not aware that we're all doing the same kind of thing, and we're all inspired by the same kind of urgency and the same kind of critical need, and the time frame is such a short one. But the fact that, wait a moment, there's someone over there who's doing something, and that looks pretty interesting, and there's someone over there doing something. I thought it was entirely different, but it's not entirely different. It's just a different strategy for reaching this same goal. So we are all in it together, just like we're all contained by this ultimate reality of the biosphere, this magnificent but hard to put your mind around things that's all around us.
Yeah.
The only term I could come up for it was the within which. This is the place that contains every life that we know about. The biosphere is the within which.
And I think it's really interesting. I don't know if you've noticed this in the last few years, but there's been a focus from very interesting economic thinkers about how, you know, the role of taking care of the planet really has huge economic implications, and that's something that is kind of coming to a head in the last few years. We've got, you know, Mark Carney, who's the UN envoy on climate change, who's talking about new economic systems and the need for, you know, when Tony talks about building back better, well, building back in sustainably has become a lot of the mantra, and that's, I think, because there's all these people that Tony are talking about are starting to talk to their members of parliament or their representatives and their congressmen, and the more that we have that happening, the better we'll be in terms of the policy space and making sure that this moves forward. So certainly the recognition that it's not environment versus economics, but rather it's sustainable economics that takes it all into account is, I think, a real positive for this movement.
And all the building blocks you draw attention to, Tony, are really fantastic. I see a question in the chat. Someone posited, well, why don't we use all the big long distance trails to be a building block for conservation, and just like the Appalachian Trail? And
Well,
I think
I'm delighted to hear that point's been raised, because here's another chance for two communities that have often seemed a little wary of each other.
Yeah.
Trails community and the environmental community, to make common cause.
Right.
An environmentalist named Paul Beyer has a rule of thumb, which is if you're building a corridor that will be wide enough to let animals and plants move around, it needs to be at least 1.25 miles wide. And that is also wide enough to accommodate people as well on a footpath, as well as the animals. So here's a chance to think of our great trails like the Continental Divide Trail in the West, or as the anchors for a whole series of landscapes that are themselves connected. And this, oddly or interestingly enough, was a vision that occurred to Benton MacKay when he was an old man, and he tried to sketch it out for the then Secretary of the Interior, Udall, back in the Johnson administration. And they said, well, thank you so much. And what he called his spiel and scheme didn't get that far, but it too is not another idea that's finally, I think, been lying around and bursting forth from the ground, ready for its day.
Tony, this is really why this book is such an important read for everybody. And you know, Valerie, thank you for playing sort of a starring role in the story here, and helping us reach across boundaries to look at how we can actually share information. And that makes me really want to just give a little pitch for the Network for Landscape Conservation, because there are over 300 partners signed up to be part of the Network for Landscape Conservation. And I think we have more work to do with our Canadian partners in this too. And because if we can start sharing these techniques and ideas among the already interested partners, we can then reach out to and convert others to, and show them how they can be part of the story. So this is, you know, this is very timely coming together at this time. And Tony, I'm glad you persevered over, what did you say, 10 years in writing this book, because the world is ready for your book today.
Thank you. It was well worth it. And yeah. I should point out that Valerie's picture is in the book, deservedly, as one of the great instigators and encouragers and inspirers. Right.
Well, and I hope everybody gets to buy your book. It's coming out today. Isn't today the big release day, or yesterday? You know, so to make the book available to everyone.
It's so nice of the Country Bookshelf in Bozeman to be standing by to take orders, even as we're talking, and be happy to offer, as I said, a signed bookplate or an inscribed signed bookplate to anyone who wants one. As the next best thing to that old-fashioned book signing we used to have, and we'll get back to after the pandemic left us alone.
And I see in the chat that people are saying, I've already bought the book. Thank you. Buying the book right now. That's always a good sign. So,
the best sign.
The best sign. And Valerie, is there any closing words you'd like to make? Because
well, maybe a couple. One is thank you for the opportunity to join you today, Tony. You know, it's a great honor, and Brenda, to spend time with you. Big shout out to the Network for Landscape Conservation and their work. I look forward to the opportunity to collaborate right across this continent. I mean, we always say the border was put between our legs in many ways. And so you know, we we look forward to that. And I hope that some of the listeners who haven't yet had a chance to visit the Boreal have an opportunity to do that once the pandemic is over and we're all healthy and able to travel again. It's a beautiful region, and many of our Indigenous peoples are just poised to welcome you, greet you, and show you the importance of this region.
Well, I'm enthusiastic about going.
Don't miss it.
Yeah.
It's a bucket list all of its own.
Well, it's certainly
especially when it involves traveling from Norman Wells to Fort Good Hope by speedboat. Hey, Tony.
Oh boy, it was a rough ride, but a wonderful ride. And that is one of the amazing qualities of the Boreal, is that so much of it is still beyond the grid of highways. You can only get to some of these towns by boat or by plane. And it makes you realize how another part of our conventional thinking is that I can get anywhere. Well, no, you can't get anywhere unless you put your mind to it. And I would just say, as a closing thought, that it's been such a privilege to meet people like Val and Brenda, because Brenda's been very helpful as I've been thinking about this book. And just that over the course of these years working on it, it's given me a chance to realize that for this glorious beleaguered planet of ours, there is room enough still, and there is time enough.
Wow. Thank you, Tony. Those inspirational words.
Well, let me just wrap up and say what an absolute pleasure it's been to be able to just listen in to this amongst the three of you, and to Val, to Tony, to Brenda. Let me just extend a very warm appreciation and thanks to you all for sharing your stories and sharing your perspectives and thoughts with us. It's been a real pleasure. I just wanted to close and bring us to close here by again reiterating that signed copies of Rescuing the Planet can be purchased through a link in the chat. There's also a link on the network's website, and really looking forward to having people dig into Tony's book. Today's conversation too was the first event in a new ongoing landscape conservation in action webinar series that the Network for Landscape Conservation is hosting. And in a delightful twist of fate, our second event, a follow-up to this in some sense, will be featuring the Yellowstone to the Yukon Conservation Initiative that Tony has touched on in today's conversation, and reflecting on what 25 years of work in the Yellowstone to Yukon area has meant, and exploring how an ambitious vision can translate to action on the ground. So don't miss that. That's April 7th, Thursday, April 7th, I'm sorry, Wednesday, April 7th. And be sure to check out the network's website for more information on that, and sign up for our electronic bulletin to make sure you stay in the loop on upcoming webinars. With that, let me just again extend my thanks and the thanks on behalf of the entire network to Tony, to Valerie, to Brenda. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the attendees who joined today and dove into the conversation and reflection and learning today. Looking forward to staying in contact and in dialogue with you all moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.